I did a day of disability exams last week, and I had two patients I was struck by. Both of them I felt would definitely qualify for Social Security disability, but they were going about it the wrong way because they'd never heard of Social Security's listing of impairments. In my experience, most people applying for Social Security haven't heard of the listings, and your doctor, unless they do Social Security disability exams, has probably never heard of the listings. And when I started doing Social Security exams, I didn't know about Social Security's listing of impairments. But Social Security's employees certainly do, because they use the listings every day to help determine if someone is disabled or not. So I think it can really help if you know about the listing of impairments, which is what I'm going to go over in this video. Hello, I'm John Foster. I'm a medical doctor who does Social Security disability exams, and as usual, everything I say reflects my own opinions based on my own experience and study, and not the opinions of the Social Security Administration or any other medical body. Now, I'm going to describe those two patients and see if you can figure out the mistakes they were making. I'm going to reveal the mistakes at the end of this video. The first was a person in their 50s who'd been born deaf to a family with many deaf relatives. Despite that, he'd worked full-time up until the mid-50s, when he developed problems with his spine that made him leave his employment. When I saw him, he wanted me to do a spinal exam on him. He was upset that I wasn't going to examine his spine. The second patient had a hereditary neurodegenerative disease called Charcot-Marie-Tooth syndrome. He had a sister with the same syndrome who had been approved for Social Security disability in just 1 month. He had severe problems with both legs and both arms due to this disease. He had began applying for Social Security disability 2 years ago and initially had been turned down. This was his second application for Social Security disability. Now, if you're finding this interesting, you may want to subscribe to my channel. I generally put out one disability-related video a week. Social Security's listing of impairments, there are actually two, one for adults and one for children, lists most conditions that can cause disability, and the criteria that Social Security uses to determine if a person is disabled with one condition only or not. If you meet their criteria, it's said that you have met a listing, and if you meet a listing, Social Security considers you disabled, period. Now, to meet a listing, your condition must be quite severe. In fact, if you read through Social Security's listing of impairments, you'll see the word severe used over and over again. The majority of people who qualify for Social Security disability don't meet a listing. The way they qualify is they have 2 or more disabling conditions, neither of which alone would meet a listing, but all rolled up together. Social Security decides that the person is disabled. However, again, if you have one problem that meets a Social Security disability listing, bam, you're approved for Social Security disability, or at least you should be. I'm going to leave links to the adult and the child listing in the description to this video below. The listings are divided into sections. The adult is divided into musculoskeletal, that's bones, joints, muscles, and tendons. Special senses and speech, that's sight, hearing. Balance, which is largely controlled by the inner ears, and speech. Respiratory, which is breathing and lung issues. Cardiovascular, which is heart and blood vessel issues. Endocrine, which is gland issues. Congenital disorders that affect multiple body systems. This is problems that a person is born with that affect more than one system. For example, most people are familiar with Down syndrome, in which patients have an intellectual disability. They also have abnormal faces and hands and often have serious problems with their heart. Neurological, which is problems with the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Mental, which is mental health, psychiatric and psychological conditions. Cancer, which is obvious, and immune system, which is disorders of the immune system, such as AIDS. In the childhood listing, there is also low birth weight and failure to thrive. The average birth weight of an infant in North America is 7.5 pounds. Very low birth weight children, which is 3 pounds 8 ounces or less, automatically qualify for disability. Also, failure to thrive, which is failure of a child to grow, not gaining weight, not getting taller, or even losing weight, may qualify as well. Just so people don't panic, when a child is born, especially if breastfed, it's normal to lose a little weight in the first few days of life. Up to 7% weight loss is normal, which is about 6 to 8 ounces. That weight, however, should be regained by the 10th day. Also note that when growth is measured, standard growth charts for the United States are used. I once had a mother come to me in a panic because her doctor said that her son wasn't growing normally. He was below the lower limit of normal for height and weight. He had no history of health problems. Well, the fact was the mother was Asian and she was small for an Asian woman. Her husband was Caucasian, but he was small for a Caucasian man. This child had 2 very small parents. It was perfectly healthy. Nothing was wrong with it. It was just a child of 2 small parents. So, for the adult listings, generally a condition must cause severe limitation of work-related abilities. Now, how can you use the listing of impairments if you're applying for disability? Well, number one, you don't need to study all the listings. I need to study them all, but you don't. What you should do is study the listing for the problem or problems you have. Number one, you want to see if you meet the criteria for a listing. If you do, you really want to emphasize that in your application when you fill out Form 3373, and if you have a disability exam, you want to go over how you meet the listing of impairments. Let's say you don't meet the listing, but you have multiple conditions. Well, by reading the listings, you can determine what Social Security feels is important, and then determine if you have the problems that Social Security feels is important. If you do, again, you want to emphasize them in your application. Now, some of the criteria are quite easy to understand. For example, in musculoskeletal, if you have severe loss of use of both legs or both arms, or one arm and one leg, you meet a listing. Well, severe loss of use of both legs or both arms, that's pretty easy to understand. Some of the listings are quite technical. For example, in the cardiovascular listing for heart failure, there's a lot of mention of ejection fraction, and most lay people are not familiar with ejection fraction. If you find you cannot understand the listing, I suggest you contact your doctor or a nurse, and they can help you determine if you meet the listing. Now, I'm going to return to the two patients that I mentioned at the beginning of this video and explain what was going wrong. The first one was a man who was born deaf, who'd worked all his life, but then had developed problems with his neck and back that had caused him to leave work. The thing was, he was applying based on his spinal problems. It's fairly difficult to get approved for spinal problems, and there's a good chance he would have been denied. However, deafness meets a listing. Now, by deafness, I mean you have to be deaf as a post. As an example, you have to have a 90 decibel hearing loss. For an approximation, that means if you're operating a gas-powered lawnmower, you cannot hear the engine. It doesn't mean you're kind of hard of hearing or that you have tinnitus, ringing in your ears. It really means that you're deaf. Well, this man really was deaf. He met a listing. So he would be approved for Social Security disability based on his deafness. That was all he needed. If you meet a listing for more than 2 conditions, you don't get extra money. You get the same amount of money once you qualify, whether you have 1 condition or a dozen conditions. So I was able to persuade him that the best way to get approved for Social Security disability was through a deafness exam. The second patient had severe loss of use of both legs. Both legs were completely paralyzed below the knee and completely numb. And he had marked loss of use of both arms. Both of his arms were going numb below the elbow, not completely, but significantly. And both of his hands were significantly weak, not completely paralyzed, but significantly weak. I tried to get him to stand up, and he could barely stand up with me helping to hold him up, and if I let go, he would have collapsed, and he couldn't even walk 1 step. So he clearly met a listing with severe loss of use of both legs and marked loss of use of both arms. Social Security grades problems mild, moderate, marked, and severe. When he was denied the first time, I believe Social Security made an error, that he should have been approved. What he should have done, knowing that he met a listing, was immediately appeal, a written appeal. And if that was denied, he should have appealed again and pled his case in administrative law court. I'll bet a lot of money that he would have been approved, and that would have been done about a year ago. His mistake was giving up when he was denied the first time, waiting beyond the appeal period, and then reapplying when he had to go through the whole process again, wasting time. Well, I hope this has been helpful, and as always, remember, if it happens, it's possible.